brother.
On deck, we have Brother Jake Thompson. Brother Jake is a dear brother and very dear friend of mine. I cannot say enough good things about him. If I start to say all the good things about him, he'll get embarrassed and start yelling at me. So what I'd rather do is have Brother Jake kind of do his quick version of a Masonic resume so that we can see what kind of work he's been doing, and then we'll get started into circumambulation. Brother Jake?
Thanks, Brother Randy. It's an honor and pleasure to be here tonight, brethren. Hopefully everybody can see me on their screens, and I'm not scaring you away too much. As Randy said, my name is Jake Thompson, and well, you want a resume. I am a past master of Troy and Silex lodges. Both of those lodges are located about an hour north of St. Louis, and I have the honor, privilege, and pleasure to serve the Grand Lodge of Missouri in several capacities this year and over the past years. I'm an active Scottish Rite Mason and involved in the education programs there, as well as through several other bodies. I think that's probably about the most efficient way to do an introduction. Is my audio coming through okay? I was having some feedback there for a second. Okay, awesome. So tonight, I'm going to clean up after Brother Baruti did such an exceptional job here, and I'm going to run the train right off the tracks. For brothers who know me, I like to speak off the cuff. I really don't do a lot of discussions of this nature with slides unless it's like a historical talk or something of that nature. Tonight's piece is hopefully going to encourage you to think a little bit more about your own journeys in Masonry, and for those of us when we get back into lodge rooms and chapter rooms and various other bodies, consider some of these perspectives, consider some of these thoughts. This isn't really meant to be an overly groundbreaking presentation, more just to pique your interests and maybe pull the veil just aside on a couple slight things that we know here and there that maybe just don't pop into your mind, or perhaps somebody just didn't bring up to you. So, give me just a second. Tonight's discussion is on ambulation, thoughts for consideration on the journey, the initiation, preparation, and its relationship and purpose in the craft. Throughout Masonry, this idea of a journey of circumambulation in the lodge permeates many of our rites and our activities. And its importance is central in a lot of ways to our ritual, although not often pointed out. And that concept of circumambulation, that concept of a journey, is something that's part of our society in many ways outside of the craft lodge and outside of your Masonic experiences. Circumambulation in its simplest forms, to most brothers, is movement from point A to point B. It allows the transition for examination and inquiry upon the qualifications, as well as assurances that the candidate is duly and truly prepared. Yet, even in the scope of that, there's a bit more to what meets the eye. It's a passing of the veils. It's an inspection through hierarchy and preparation for both internal and external ascent and descent in that same journey. It may also seem to be beyond the scope of our ritual at times to even consider some of these deeper aspects, as we don't often focus on that word circumambulation or the routes themselves. But their presence is valid and important, and it has a continued meaning. We see it pop up again and again, whether that's one motion, 35, 7 motions, They all hold value, and as a tool, provide an impressive method to show the ideas of transition, transformation, and movement towards a better understanding of the lessons of the craft, ourselves, and of course our deity. And we see this concept of circumambulation used in various ways, not only in the York or American Rite, but also in the Scottish Rite, in our craft lodges, and various other appendant orders and bodies. It's an essential piece for, like many of those symbols that are left for us to discover with little elaboration in the craft lodge, it too is a symbol. And it too has a representation beyond just going around from point A to point B. Look at its many iterations, from the Middle Chamber lecture to the trials and tribulations of the lamented master architect of the temple. The brothers here ascend and pass towards guarded places in search of knowledge. They make that action happen in pursuit of something greater than themselves, in pursuit of understanding something better than themselves. And within that, they pursue the knowledge, the fellowship, the brotherhood, as well as those things illustrated upon the trestle board, leading us further into an understanding of our own selves and its relationship with the divine. The idea of what circumambulation is takes many forms, and where it comes also has many different backgrounds and histories. Interestingly enough, if we go to Mackey, and I did not personally feel like writing all half a page of his definition down was worthy, because it's Mackey, and he is a great resource for short snippets, but sometimes he gets wordier than Pike. Mackey, in his definition of circumambulation, goes straight to talking about this idea of the rite of circumambulation, and he discusses some of the Greek and Roman mystery schools and some of their actions and activities. In his lexicon of Freemasonry, though, Mackey kind of sums it up in a little bit of a shorter iteration, explaining what he sees circumambulation as. He says that it was used by the ancient Greeks and Druids as they processed around the altar. And he of course mentions the Reverend Brother Oliver, who referenced that the footstones of the Temple of Solomon were leveled by Solomon and the 12 tribes, who circumambulated Mount Moriah 3 times. If we look at kind of a more written out verbal form and something a little more recent, according to the Grand Lodge of Missouri's mentoring program that was developed by a committee several years ago, circumambulation is a technical term for a ceremony in which our candidates walk around the lodge. And it just basically explains the idea of movement around a central point, and it refers back in line with what Mackey talks about, this idea that ancient religions and mysteries had their worshipers walking around an altar, imitating the movements of the sun, and of course they claim and lay out that this became the origin of the ceremony. But why? Why is this ceremony so important? What is its value? Why does it have such a deep meaning to the rites of initiation? Well, circumambulation, even though it represents just a journey around the altar in the sense of Masonic or initiatic work as we generally know it, it falls into that idea of almost a quest or a journey. And in that concept, we know, whether you look at various other authors, you can watch TV, read history books, the idea of a quest or a journey captures men's attention. It captures the population and riles them to action. Our world is surrounded by this concept, and it's woven to the fabric of our being. From an idea prolific in the young United States of that idea of manifest destiny in the frontier to the paths of various religions. So this need for a journey, this need for advancing oneself, moving oneself forward, we find that prevalent in several main running themes. The idea of a youth or a man in manhood proceeding further is seeking advancement, perhaps enlightenment, a cure, riches, and glory. Whether those riches, as I note down later, are tangible or intangible, or perhaps it's a group of people seeking safety and freedom. Within those broad strokes, we see the baseline for this idea of the importance of the journey or the quest. It rewards that individual in pursuit. It pays dividends to them, whether that's knowledge or safety or fellowship, or the revealing of some further knowledge or concept beyond just the grasp of what they thought they were going after. It's deep, it's continued, and it is prolific no matter where we look for it. They all accentuate a path and advance. And even in some cases, these journeys, these quests, represent a regression as we move perhaps backward into ourselves or to a state of more simplicity and a baseline of not all the frills, if you will, of life. We see these paths laid out for the aspirant, the initiate, the candidate, the sage, the magus, whatever you want to call them as they're moving forward, the explorer. All of these things come to play in this concept of a quest. And we see it over time. We see this idea of the journey over time, this quest over time. And it permeates several different sagas and epics that we could talk about all night. You can see it in examples of the ideas of the Hebrew tribes and their journey during the Exodus. The journey that's discussed and the concepts discussed in Plato's allegory of the cave, where the individual is able to escape the cave and receives that knowledge, that idea, that gnosis, understanding, and of course tries to return to the cave to pass it on. We see it in the ideas of the quests for the Holy Grail, El Dorado, the Fountain of Youth. We see it in the journey of Christian Rosencreutz, as illustrated both in the Fama Fraternitatis and the Chemical Wedding of himself. These texts, these legends, these quests, they lay things before us. We see it in the stories that came up around an early United States seeking to overtake the frontier, seeking to subdue what they saw as wild territory, if you will, with the ideas of manifest destiny. It is in contemplating these journeys, it's in contemplating our own journey that we see the value. And in these journeys, we read and we understand that men learn about themselves. They learn about their place and their connection with deity, their place and connection with other men through its twists and turns. And we find glimmers of insight and perspective, and we discover things along the way that build us, that built these men and enabled them to complete whatever aspect of the journey they're on. It's a tale told in many, many methods, and it follows patterns we saw in concepts of the hero's journey, hero of a thousand faces, however you want to look at it. This idea of a movement, a progression in search of something, is foundational to many societies, to many actions, to many stories. It makes the best of stories, and it makes the most solid of concepts when we reflect on growth, development, advancement. These contexts, of course, follow us. They don't just stick with us in the more open known things, the more base concepts as we talked about, those ideas of El Dorado and the Fountain of Youth. They go with us. And these journeys aren't just confined to the concepts of, Rooster Cogburn going after his bounty, or Indiana Jones in pursuit of the Grail. These are brothers, men, women, human beings moving forward to better themselves, better society, etc. And these concepts, of course, aren't found just in those external places. They're found within the mystery schools, within the faiths, within the early religions. And these processes and these concepts hold a great significance in these various bodies. and within the mystery schools and the initiatic rites that have developed over time. But its importance can't be understated. The idea of a transition, a movement, it's a clear demarcation. It enacts a change. It forces and imparts perspective, and it creates moments for contemplation, reflection, and realization, for active and passive growth, within and without. Yet, these journeys within the mystery school and other rites aren't just confined to the concept of the Mithraic mysteries or the Egyptian rites or even Masonic rites, because they transcend that. We see the parallels of them in various other bodies, both public and private. And these concepts are all woven together in various ways. We see the importance of trials, tribulations, the importance and the emphasis of these rites of passage, whether they're acknowledged or not. And they all serve to demarcate, draw a line in the sand, separate, elect, consecrate an individual, our place in time, our point in time, and our position as we move forward. So how do we see this idea of the journey, the quest, exemplified in circumambulation? How do we see it in the craft and in Masonic bodies and what we know of and what we can kind of allude to here tonight? Well, it permeates in a lot of ways various aspects of our degree work, of our allegories. The candidates' movements about the lodge room are not only just for review. They're there to impress the importance and the need for his investment as a neophyte, as a candidate, to take some time to set himself apart to a task, to sojourn in pursuit of his membership, in pursuit of knowledge, in pursuit of light. Because if he sets himself apart, if he humbles himself to that task, he's making himself better. He's strengthening himself. If we think of the way we prepare our candidates, the way we prepare men coming into the craft as they enter, as they proceed through the work, it's not to embarrass, it's not to laugh, it has a purpose, but in a way it's humbling them, it's bringing them to the same level as every other brother who walked through that door. And they're on that same journey, that same path. Within the work, we see the use of circumambulation as pivotal. Without it, there's no process of change. Movement, no pattern which creates a connection, a concept of ascending to the divine, descending within oneself. None of these things occur. We can hear the words, but the process that's added to it by the motion, the impact of those motions sets it apart and makes it more. And when I think about that, when I think of the use of circumambulation, I think back to when I joined my college fraternity, which had a ritual written by Masons in Ohio. And my fraternity, when you first entered the chapter room for your first time, they took you on a long winding path, is what they called it. Really, it was just slinking you around this big room and hoping they didn't run you on accident in one of the columns or pillars because you were hoodwinked. But it had a meaning, and they told you afterwards, they said, this is to remind you that life's road is winding. You're going to face trials and tribulations. And then on the second entrance, you came straight on in and went right to where you needed to be. And that was to teach you of the importance of being direct and seizing the day and those types of things. Even in that, there were meanings. But the idea and the concepts we impress in the work, in our discussions, and how we move the candidates, there's something there to think about. And we see the journey and the movements of the candidate around the room. We see it in the incidents surrounding the chief architect of the temple's fatal journey in the courts of the temple. We see it in the pursuit of the Elu or the craftsman after certain murderers. We see it within various esoteric and Hermetic and Rosicrucian circles, especially in that sense, when they discuss the idea of Frater Christian Rosenkreuz and his journey, where he left his homeland, traveling eastward, seeking knowledge, gaining that knowledge, and then sojourning back west. And it's in that journey that he picks up so much. And if we think about that relationship, we think about some of the underlying concepts of our own work when we consider the journey and the idea of what happens when we move the candidate around the room. We see some interesting parallels there. Actively seeking light. And by the virtue of our efforts, these concepts can be revealed to us. And when we can see this idea of moving towards light of the journey in about any body you speak of, it isn't just isolated, of course, to what we're talking about here. But its importance is key. Because in each one of these various bodies, in each one of these actions, we're facing trials. We're facing potentially a rough and rugged road. We're facing tribulations that are beset by danger. And by our own determination to learn, by our own zeal, our own fortitude, our own willpower, sheer willpower, in some cases, we proceed. And we dedicate ourselves to moving forward in that journey. So, what are some other aspects of circumambulation, of the candidate's movement, that idea of going around the room, or as Mackey states, circling the altar? To a degree, as we reflect on it more, there at least is some tangible potential meaning wrapped into the idea of preparation and purification. Because as initiates, we are seeking admittance into this higher knowledge, and we are seeking to be properly prepared and purified and consecrated to a better purpose, to a new charge, to a new life, if you will, in some ways. So what are some of these concepts? And we'll talk about several of these tonight. And some of these are concepts you may not have popped into your head regarding this, but we're going to talk a little bit about, in the idea of circumambulation, the idea of gavel wraps, the importance of the direction of the movement, the idea of purification by elements, or whether that's the idea of lustration or water, by fire, air, earth, importance and potential effect of scriptural changes, the idea of what circumambulation has in relevance to setting a space apart, and then we'll briefly touch on some of the relevance circumambulation has to the zodiac, seasons, the cycles of life, things like life, death, rebirth, various other cycles that play into that, and circumstances that can play into that concept. If you think about these things, these ideas, these concepts, and you think about the process of circumambulation, the idea that we're taking a candidate into the body of a lodge, into this gathered group, and by his free will and accord, he's arrived there. By our election, he's admitted, and his acceptance, he's further brought in. These various actions help to delineate further his change in himself, his pursuit, his understanding. So as we go through these, we'll try to hit on them, and I'll point out as best I can, at least my thoughts. And as I said, this is kind of a contemplative thing that I hope you see. I'm not saying this is gospel by any means. You take it as something to think about and consider in the future. And the first thing is this idea of the gavel wraps. The gavel in a lodge, at least per Missouri's Masonic manual, and this is in full print, so I'm not really showing anything off here. We're told that the common gavel is an instrument made use of by operative masons to break off the corners of rough stones, the better to fit them for the builder's use. But we as free and accepted masons are taught to make use of it for the more noble and glorious purpose of divesting our hearts and consciences of all the vices and superfluities of life, thereby fitting our minds as living stones for that spiritual building, that house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. I was always struck by that statement, that the common gavel is an instrument that's supposed to help us divest ourselves of all our superfluities and our vices. And when you think about that statement, that's an insinuation right there that we have impurities about us, which we know. We have things that need to be chipped away. We're rough ashlers that need to be squared up and cleaned up. And the more I thought about that, I reflected upon the point that batteries and wraps, whether it's 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 12, 15, in various bodies, appear in various groups, various organizations. We're not just talking masonry here. They all appear. And the more I focused on that and the more I thought about it, I was considering the idea that perhaps the common gavel is espoused in the degree of entered apprentice. It's brought up as a working tool for us to think about the fact that as we move about the lodge, if we hear a gavel, if we move about the lodge and we hear that resounding, that hit, maybe that's supposed to remind us that we should be divesting ourselves of some of those superfluities. Maybe it's a reminder and a passing, if you will, of another veil, another level. We're further removing some of our passions. We're further removing some of our vices and those superfluities that pollute us. And so by each one of those movements, we're removing more, hopefully making ourselves a better ashlar for the time when we ascend to the altar, we take those obligations or we proceed further in the degree. The more I reflected on that, it made more and more sense that we, as we're preparing to ascend in degrees, ascend in knowledge, ascend in our understanding of deity, I'll leave it at that, we have to purify ourselves. We have to cleanse ourselves. So I think, in a way, that turned a light on for me to think about, maybe this is there for not just a reason of getting somebody's attention. Maybe it's just not there to give somebody a breath in between lines. Maybe it's just not a, little bit of ceremony added in. It has a purpose. And whether that's real, imagined, or whatnot, I think there's some relevance to it in our consideration of the common gavel and our actions within the lodge room, within the degree work. Because we hear that in about almost every body. You're going to hear some form of that reminder, hearkening back in a way to your first admittance into a lodge room and your first passing into the lodge room. Additionally, there's the idea of delineation, or setting a space apart. We already know that the lodge is a sacred space. We guard our lodge rooms with tilers. And I once had a very learned brother tell me that what we do in a lodge room, it ought to be worth having a tiler guard it. But our lodge is a sacred space. That brother entering the lodge comes within it, and he proceeds to circumambulate around the lodge. And as he's moving around the lodge, as he is going forward, he's circling that altar. He's making that trip. And in that movement, we can see from some perspectives, some traditions, a sort of ceremonial act akin to natural or ceremonial magic, in which you're setting off a space. And if we consider the movements, and I won't go into ritual here by any means, but think about what the candidate does. And I'm not saying this is 100% to key in every state, because I know it won't be, nor every movement. But nobody goes inside that space but him and those designated principal individuals. even when we get to some of the other later parts. He sets that space off and it's consecrated. He himself, circumambulating the lodges, is consecrating that space, setting it apart by his answers, by his actions, by divesting himself of his superfluities around that space, and he's entering into that sacred central spot. If you consider that, you consider some of the placement of some of the officers, and you consider some of the deeper significance, perhaps, of the principal officers, of the deacons, without going into any crazy elaboration there's some really cool context of what occurs. There's some really cool context, and the potential meanings of that, following this idea of the candidate himself setting the space apart, is really worth our own reflection. And I would encourage you, next time you watch a degree, to think about that and reflect on it. Additionally, and this I won't go into too much, just because it is a beast of a topic. But the idea of the planets, the constellations, the seasons, relating to a journey, relating to circumambulation is huge. And I really mean huge. Albert Pike himself devotes maybe 20 pages, at least in one part of Morals and Dogma, and then another 15 to 30 in another section, just about, not saying circumambulation, but about the zodiac, the movement of the seasons, and the journey of a candidate, as well as Master Hiram, and the Grand Masters and some things like that. It's prolific. But if we think about a candidate's movement, if we think about a candidate's actions, this is something it'll wow you the first time you actually sit down and look at it. So I'm going to beg your forgiveness real quickly. I was looking for a good picture that would line up with what I wanted, and I couldn't get one. This image is flipped, so I apologize on that. It should be flipped image, but what's important is Leo is at the summer solstice, and I want to bring that up just because the way the zodiac applies itself, and the way many Masonic scholars have looked at this, and we've applied it to the movement of a lodge and the actions within a lodge, you can often believe that the winter solstice is representative of that moment when possibly the Grand Master meets his fate. And the summer solstice being that point when he is recovered, risen, however you wish to say it. Within that same frame, there's often thought that the autumn months are representatives of three misguided fellow crafts. But there's some real beauty to this when you lay it out to a lodge floor. Consider movements. And we'll briefly touch on that here in a second, and we'll swing back to that. But just keep that in mind, and its significance. Additionally important in this idea of circumambulation, and we really haven't said circumambulation a whole lot, I've really kind of kept saying the journey, because I think it is a journey. It's a passage, it's a process. Look at some of the older tracing boards of our degrees that come out of England, that come out of older lodges in Europe. Right here you see two fairly generic versions of old tracing boards, an entered apprentice tracing board and a fellow craft. And if you notice, both of them, while not just said blatantly out there, they represent some type of transition, some type of advancement, some type of progression. We have Jacob's ladder on the entered apprentice. On the fellow craft, we have, of course, the middle chamber. Interestingly, and many brothers probably don't always see this on this tracing board, we think about the middle chamber and we're ascending to it. We're going there. We're learning these other important lessons. We're further moving within King Solomon's temple. But if we notice, even within this building, and I'm going to try to use the annotation tool here to my worst luck, up inside the building, there seems to be this blazing item. And of course, here it's represented by the letter G. In other ones, you'll see a pentagram, sometimes a yod, sometimes just a blazing star. I always thought that was interesting, a unique addition, and it never really hit me till I had a discussion with a brother who was talking about the idea that in every degree we're advancing. In every degree we're ascending, we're moving forward to a better understanding of ourselves, to a better understanding of deity, mankind, and our existence. Well, what reason then is there that wouldn't be deity? The sun's not shining through some giant hole in the building. That's a representation of us ascending towards deity. If I can get my mouse to work, I'll get rid of that. There we go. So this idea of ascent and descent is key with circumambulation, especially the more we consider it as our movements. Every time we enter a lodge, we're moving in a particular direction. And of course, traditionally, circumambulation is often equated to following the path of the sun, following its movements, its evolution, and its development through the year. And that's key, and that's important that we notice that, we acknowledge it, and that ties to some of those zodiac concepts that we just fairly briefly touched on. And that's part of the idea of ascent, ascending to a better knowledge, apotheosis, if you really want to use that word, okay, in understanding God and your deity and your place in the world. But you're also descending. I know that doesn't make sense when I say you're going up a staircase and you're descending, but you're descending deeper into yourself. You're ascending deeper into your understanding of yourself, even with a journey to ascend to more knowledge. And it plays a two-way street consistently in some ways. And that's something to keep in mind. And if you think about it, think about as the candidate moves in his journey, as the brothers move in their journey, even in the regular footwork of the lodge, the shifts they make, the directions they make. When they change direction, it's usually for a significant reason. There's something big that's happened. Now, it may not seem big right off the bat to you as you're watching it, but if you think about the context, it's a big change, and it's the demarcation. It's an advancement, an evolutionary point in their passage, in their understanding of mankind and themselves. Think about a lodge room, and if we think about this lodge room and we were to kind of apply the ideas of the solar system, the zodiac, the sun's movements, we all know that the north is a place of darkness. And if we think about it, when a candidate's brought in, not through your Tyler's door, but however they're brought in the room, they're probably brought in darkness anyway. And they experience that darkness till they pass a point of light. And at which point there's some divine wording said, some scripture perhaps. And if you think about that, that's a life-giving idea. And there's some great connotation to that. But if we think about the officers' roles, and we think about circumambulation in the journey, and we apply this idea of potentially the movement of the sun, man's passage through time, and the zodiac, then let's look at, let's see if I can get to work, these two images. We have, of course, the lodge layout, as you see, and we have the circumpump with two eminent patrons of masonry, and, of course, the volume of sacred law on the top. What's interesting, brothers, and I would encourage you to think about this, what if we were to take, and I'm not going to try because my animation skills with PowerPoint are ridiculous. The fact we have pictures here is a miracle. But if I were to take the image of the circumpump and turn it 90 degrees so that that holy book rested in the east, so that the dot was at the center of the lodge, And the two perpendicular lines were our north and south line, two saints on the outside. If you look about that and you consider that the east is that place where light comes from, and you reflect upon the two parallel lines perhaps representing the tropics, there's some cool symbolism there with how the sun moves and what it does at the various tropics. But I also think there's some neat symbolism there when you look at the idea that we think of the north as a place of darkness. We think of John the Baptist as generally a guy who came into a very dark, potentially dark world and lightened it up with a lot of what he said. He lived very plainly, that type of thing. That kind of fits with that theme of the north. John the Evangelist, I haven't completely in my mind settled exactly how he fits to that other side. But there's some interesting connotation just to that symbol in general. And of course, the arrangement of the circumpunct has changed over time, and things have been added to it, like the volume of sacred law and the two saints. But if we were to turn that 90 degrees, set that there, then you see, again, an example of circumambulation perhaps representing the journey of the sun, following through to things like the Master Mason degree and further journeys as we reflect on those concepts of movement within the lodge. Because every movement has a purpose. Every action has a meaning, whether we see it or not. And of course, various jurisdictions have various differentiations in work. They all have their own little quirks, their own development, their own history. And it's what makes those works unique. Yet, the action of circumambulation, the movement of the candidate, is purposeful. It has meaning. And perhaps it's not just about moving us from point A to point B. Perhaps it's about encouraging us to think, to give us time while we're journeying, we're sojourning in search of knowledge on that rough and rugged road, while we're humble, seeking knowledge, surrounded in a strange place, at least at the moment, perhaps, wanting further light. So, with that being said, that's kind of my little discussion for tonight. Main purpose, of course, was to just have a little bit of thought on the idea of what can circumambulation mean, where can it potentially take us. This is really just kind of a thought-provoking piece in that alley. Resource-wise, I kind of jumped a whole bunch of little spots for some things, including the Missouri Manual of Masonry, Missouri's mentoring program, a couple books by good old Albert Mackey, Rosicrucian text, and some things like that. So thank you, brothers.
Awesome. Thank you, Brother Jake. We have some comments and we have some questions. Let's see. Brother Ron, I see Brother Timothy's point here. He's talking about, whoops, made a couple of points. Who's sharing? Timothy. Okay.
That's Timothy.
Why don't you go ahead and explain what you were going to say there? You're probably on mute.
I've got his comment here, or at least part of it. I can read, Randy, and it's an interesting one. Timothy's mentioning that when a candidate is circumambulating, at least per his ritual, the first column they pass is in the south, which is often attributed to youth and beauty. Then they pass the second column, attributed to strength and manhood, and then the final, of course, being the east and the column of wisdom, reinforced by the master's carpet. And I think that's a valid point, and that's something I've kind of thought on before myself. I think it's definitely worth acknowledging, because we are discussing that idea of passing from youth into manhood and age. That's definitely there. It's part of the process. It's part of that growth and that cycle. Yes.
All right, Brother CT, did you see some comments over on the Facebook page that we'd like to maybe highlight?
There was a question asked, is the chamber reflection allowed to be practiced in the state of Missouri for the candidate or candidates? I did happen to answer that in the chat. No, it is not used in the Blue Lodges of here in Missouri, but it is practiced in the we do have it in the ASR and also in the York Rite when you get to the Orders of the Temple. But if Jacob or somebody wants to take that a little bit further, by all means.
In Missouri, it's not part of the work. Various York Rite bodies do utilize it. And as kind of a historical demonstration, I know several Missouri Scottish Rite bodies at least kind of showed as part of the education as a brief experience, so guys can see what used to be part of the work.
There was also one more comment on the Facebook. This is, don't forget also the point within the circle is the alchemical symbol of gold.
Yeah.
Transformation of the candidate from lead to the gold of Master Mason.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And I think that's one of the things that's beautiful about the circumpunct. I don't think a lot of people take time to break down its various aspects. That circle with the dot, symbol for gold, the sun, one of the oldest symbols of deity. It has so much great usability. And I kind of might here. Give me just a second. What I think is great about that. If I can, give me just a second, brothers. When we think about these concepts and we think about the circumpunct and gold and light, if you set that image like I kind of suggested just in passing, if you were to set it going east to west instead of like we look at it north to south, and it is a symbol, of course, of gold and light, that dot sits right in the middle of the lodge. So that's a point of light, the volume of sacred law, a point of light right there in the center. And of course, you can think about that all you want when we consider the idea of the lodge being a representation of the universe, being a representation of King Solomon's temple, being a representation of man. There's so many great levels of perspective we can look at with this that make it fantastic. And I think that's why I've always been drawn to paying attention to the idea of what's espoused and what's done through the concept of the candidates' movements, whether it is circumambulation or it's an additional act, because I think there's purpose there. There's a level of deep action that not everybody thinks about. I mean, and you think about it, if you watch A Degree with the Brother or a candidate or anything, sometimes candidates may get rushed through. They're just scurried through because they're fast walkers or something. Who knows, whatever you want to say. But it's a deliberate act. It's an important act. And, of course, we can't tell anybody really to slow down. I guess you could, but it has a purpose. It has a meaning. But when we layer it with these other symbols, we see, we pull the veil back another level. We see another angle, a new perspective. And I think that's what's neat about it. So, yeah.
Do we have any other questions?
Maybe I have a remark.
Go ahead.
The point within the circle and the two parallel lines, normally that paraphernalia that is an attribute of a lodge is located on the west side of the altar. So the circle is actually the same height as the altar itself, with the two parallel lines, and on the top of the altar, of course, without having to make a little illustration of it, is the volume of sacred law. And the point is smack in the middle of that circle, and which also represents what you were just mentioning about the circumambulation. That's the focus of any of the rituals that we are using.
Well, and that's a good point. I think, and various different jurisdictions, and I know different lodge workings have it illustrated in that manner in various other functions. So that's neat to know that perspective. Thank you.
So, Brother Jake, I think one of the other things that he was getting at was that makes perfect sense in many of the jurisdictions that we're talking about. I think you and I have both seen a couple of jurisdictions where the point was where the candidate was, and the altar was actually moved up or moved closer to the east. And we've also seen that the diameter of the diameter of that circle doesn't necessarily fit what we would normally consider the diameter of the circle in most jurisdictions. Does not necessarily fit the lodges, because some of these lodges are quite small, and then we've got other halls that are quite large. So it's there's some variance in there that has to come into play, and some understanding that there isn't a one size fits all, because there can't be. But do you want to talk about some of the altar setups and some of the different blue lodges?
Yeah, I can't say that I'm a real altar snob of sorts, where I know have a real appreciation of them. I do have a fascination with Scottish Rite altar arrangements, just because I think it's kooky and crazy how many we have. But yeah, the positioning of the altar being closer to the east, being much nearer the master, is definitely something that kind of shifts that perspective for sure. And within that case, of course, the candidate isn't circling the altar. He's on the floor, circling the floor. What's interesting by that, and I'm going to may speak out of turn on this, but at least in some of those cases, there's generally like a tracing board on the floor, or some type of depiction, at least in a few of them, with perhaps maybe the blazing star or some other symbol representation of a central point, perhaps, to consider. That I think you could play into that idea there a little bit. I know that's not 100% what you were probably thinking, but that's something that popped in my mind as you were talking about it.
Yeah, in this case, the tracing board that is placed on the floor in the center of the lodge with the three lesser lights is becoming the focus of the meeting, and the circumambulations is always taking place around those three candles. And
not to go into anything super crazy or deep, but when we think about the meaning of the lesser lights, I can see some good correlation there to some of that concept pretty easily as I'm reflecting on it now. But that's definitely a valid point. One thing I would mention as an aside to this idea of the journey and the quest, we talk about it in circumambulation as the candidates moving around the lodge room, which is accurate. It's very true. But if we think at the other perspective of other bodies, other rites, whether that's the York Rite, the Scottish Rite, their circumambulation can be much more intense just in terms of number and other actions. But what also intrigues me is, at least in several of those workings, you're going to inevitably find a journey actually discussed, and we're talking about a specific, hey, you're going over here type thing, and that journey has a saga to it. It has a meaning that hopefully you're going to pick something from up that's directly told you, you're going on that quest. It isn't so much I don't want to say an unassumed journey, but when the candidate is circumambulating in a lodge, he doesn't know exactly what's going on right off the bat, if you will, if that makes sense. I don't know if I'm being clear kind of with that point. So I think there's some intrigue to that, because in those cases, the candidate knows he's going on that journey, and he may encounter some type of rough and rugged road or altercation or things. But that's supposed to impress upon him the need to be ready, to be prepared, to make sacrifice and things. It's not an unknown right off the bat.
Thank you. So, as we start wrapping up here, one last call for questions or comments or considerations on this.
Greg had a comment in the chat. The placement of the altar in the east, right in the front of the master of the lodge, comes from English Freemasonry.
Yep.
The American Symbolic Lodge places it in the center of the lodge.
Yeah, it's in the Scottish Rite rituals. For the first 3 degrees, I should add.
Interesting. We don't take. I don't see a whole lot in the Midwest. We don't see a whole lot of exemplification of the first 3 degrees of the Scottish Rite. There's that little matter of us agreeing in the Scottish Rite not to do those degrees in Grand Lodges in the jurisdictions, and we
That's
respect
correct.
that.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, I totally agree. I was fortunate enough to see a international lodge in Colombia, South America. They do the, I'll call them red degrees, and very interesting, very interesting. We should probably take that as a discussion topic for a future future presentation here, because that is kind of cool. The circumambulation of the lodge, the candidate's journey, the hero's quest, that's a really cool, it's a very powerful thing. If you look at anything over time, you look at 90% of the action movies out there, right? It's the unassuming hero that gets pulled into it and says, you got to go perform, and he, finds a way to get it done. This is a very, very cool thing. I really appreciate your time, Brother Jake, because this was something that you and I had talked about. We had kind of explored a couple of other pieces to it, and the way that you pulled this together, I'm very, very impressed. Is there anything that you would like to say in
sure. First off, thank you for the opportunity, Randy. We've talked about this topic a couple times, you and I, because I've been working on this in bits and pieces till you held a gun to my head here in the last week or so to slam it all together. And he knows what my workload is in the background, so he really is a glutton for punishment on doing that. I've had a great time. I hope you all enjoyed it, got some good perspective. I've only made it through a small portion of my glass with a bourbon, so I'll have to finish that later. But it's a blast. For anybody who's interested in Scottish Rite specific education, I'll do a short plug on that. I am the Director of Education every Thursday night. Our Valley does virtual education series on various degrees of the Scottish Rite. Right now, we are lining up to discuss the 11th degree tomorrow night at 7 p.m. They usually last about an hour 15. We're going to keep kicking ahead and keep going as things go on. It's been some great discussion. We have brothers from generally about 10 to 15 different valleys. And it's some great discussion because we keep it pretty open. You don't have to hear me the whole time. And potentially also for anybody to be interested, next week, it'll be announced sometime, I'm assuming in the next 24 hours, there's going to be a national, well, I say national, but it's sponsored by the Southern Jurisdiction presentation that our Valley will be part of, bringing some education there. And that'll be next week sometime, but they'll announce that the next day or so. So there's a lot of great opportunities. If you're interested in hearing some cool discussion, we do ask if you want to attend those, you do be a member of the Scottish Rite. So I'll throw my email in the chat. If you're interested in attending, kick me an email. We have a great time with it, and it's always a blast. So thank you again, Randy. It's been an honor and a pleasure. Always enjoy catching up with everybody, and seeing more familiar faces here that I need to know are here. So they all have fodder and blackmail material on me now. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Brother Jake. I'll turn the recording off, but I'll leave the chat room up if you want to go ahead and throw that email out there, Jake. And
Randy.
Yeah.
There is one thing from the Facebook thing. If I could jump
Oh
in real quick.
please do.
Christopher Johnson says it could be that the placement of the altar during the degrees is supposed to harken back to where it would be in the old days, where it could guide the master. And then he asks, it's not kept there in regular meetings, right? I think he's talking about when it's up by the master in the European.
So that's an interesting question. Not really directly in the scope of this presentation, but I'll add a couple points to it. The altar being in the East is an English, I don't want to say English thing, but it is an English tradition concept. Being in the center of the lodge is actually very old, or at least having the volume of sacred law in the center. The English kind of drifted away and went having it up front. And if you consider how the ritual developed, especially in those areas, when they're eating around a dinner table and at a tavern and things, you could see that the candidate moved around the outside of the table. That's not something we really talked about tonight, but that's in all the exposés, you know. He passed around the back of the junior warden, the senior warden, things like that. That development over time is an interesting thing, but generally speaking, in those lodges, it's my understanding it stays where it's at. And if you think about it, the idea of the master seeing the volume of sacred law, not to go into anything I shouldn't, but it's unobstructed. There's no chance of obstruction. There's no chance of anything getting kind of moved around extra. It probably makes life a little bit easier for some people who don't pay attention. But I don't know if that completely addresses his angle, but that's at least my thought on it.
Cool. I can only add in one little piece to that, and what Brother Jake was saying. In the Colombian degrees, in the Colombian lodges, the South mirrors the Lodge of Perfection in the 4th, 5th, 6th degrees. And the South is the place of darkness that nobody passes between. Kind of interesting, kind of different. You think about that in a different way. Those that are Scottish Rite Masons understand what I just said. Probably not a good idea to go too deep into that at the moment, but the concept of the unobstructed view is universal, but might not be the same for all of the ways and all of the entered apprentice, fellowcraft, or master mason lodges. So
yeah. I think actually this has been derived from the first 3 degrees of the Scottish Rite, where the volume of sacred law is at the foot of the pedestal of the master. And that's the reason why we say in the Bible lecture that the space between the volume of the sacred law and the master is never violated. You know the reasons why. So this is the reason why it's done that way. In those, if you want to see a Scottish Rite degree in the first 3 degrees, there are 10 lodges in the United States, in Louisiana, where they practice that ritual. And there is one lodge in Washington, D.C. that does that ritual as well.
In a somewhat shameless plug for Brother Moises Gomez and Mohammed Yatim, there is tell me I haven't missed it, I'm looking for it now and I don't see it. There is a upcoming education by Brother Michael Pohl on that exact thing. So look to the various Facebook pages, especially New Jersey and New York's pages, Facebook pages, Grand Lodge pages, education pages. Somewhere in that neighborhood, you're going to find that. I don't have it offhand, which is pretty sad. I'm woefully unprepared to talk to that, which is not good. But let's see. Well, maybe I do have it. Give me just a moment, brothers. And unfortunately, I do not have that page right in front of me. Okay. All right. So again, do some quick research on New Jersey, New York, AMD pages for this presentation. I'm told that Michael Pohl does just a phenomenal job. Brother Timothy wants to say 2 points on the circumambulation. Brother Timothy, go ahead. We can't hear you. Brother Timothy, I'm sorry, your audio is not coming through.
Bueller.
You may have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, there may be 2 different mute buttons there. Apologies, Brother Timothy, that's not coming through. Let's go ahead and wrap this up, though, because we're almost at the top of the hour. And I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining. Again, the coming weeks, on Wednesdays, the 29th, we've got Chuck Dunning's panel, Masons Helping Masons, and that is Masonic mental health professionals coming in to talk to us in a panel discussion on things that we can do and ways that we can use Masonic tools and Masonic work to better ourselves and cope with the issues that we're dealing with COVID-19. It's something that has never been done before. I'm just ecstatic that it's happening. That's on the 29th. That's same bat time, same bat channel next week. I'll be sending out notifications and posting it on the boards and such. Make sure you pay attention to the event section and refracted light. May the 6th, Mike Jarzabek is speaking. May the 13th, I have a special guest, and I'm going to hold off for just a moment before announcing that. And then May 20th, we're looking at Angel Millar starting an hour early because that'll be 6 p.m. Central, 7 p.m. Eastern that Angel's going to be speaking. And then at 7:30 Central, 8:30, Jason Richards is going to be speaking. So we've got another twofer on May the 20th. With that in mind, again, I thank you. I deeply appreciate you and love you brothers very much. You guys take care, and we'll see you in a week.